Welcome to the McFeely Mess Podcast at Inforum.com. In-depth conversations and opinion covering a variety of topics from the world of news, sports, and more. Here's Mike McFeely.
Welcome to another episode of the McFeely Mess Podcast at Inforum.com. And we are joined by a luminary in Minnesota politics today on the program. His name is Ken Martin, and he is the chairman of the Minnesota DFL party. And if you are from North Dakota or South Dakota or Montana or Sweden, and you don't know what the DFL is, that's the Democratic Party, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. And I had to get Ken on today because, as I've written about, and as you know, there's some stuff going on in politics, particularly as it pertains to the state of Minnesota, because the governor, Tim Walz, is in the running, apparently, to be the running mate of presumed Democratic nominee Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket in the presidential race in 2024. There's a million other things going on besides that, and we'll talk about that. But first, let's welcome in Ken Martin. Hello, sir. How are we doing?
Hey, Mike. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm actually in rural Nevada right now on a tour here, campaigning for the Harris campaign and, of course, for the DNC. I'm a vice chair of the DNC, as you all know, and so they send me all over the country. But glad to be here, and the enthusiasm and excitement is off the charts right now.
Let's start there, because that's what I had on my list, a place to start. How do you feel, and what sense are you getting from Democrats, not only in Minnesota, but around the country? Because I'll tell you how I feel is before President Biden made the announcement that he was going to drop out of the race, it was tough. All right. I'm a Joe Biden guy. I have worn my support for Joe Biden on my sleeve. The guy's policies to me have been incredibly successful. He has been as successful as the point goes in getting stuff done, and I usually use a different term than stuff, in getting stuff done in his one term than most presidents of either party do in two terms. But I was down because of what the polls were saying, because of just how things felt, just because of the vibe, the momentum, just the energy around his campaign to me. I woke up every day just going, oh my God, I don't like the way this feels. After the announcement was made, and for the past 10 days or so, I am walking about 15 feet off the ground, 1,000 miles an hour every day. And it's reflected in my writing. It's reflected in my podcasting. It's reflected around the house, because my wife has said, wow, what's going on here? I mean, are you that excited? I said, yes, I am that excited. There's something going on out there, and everything just feels different, Ken. Do you feel that same way? Do you see that
for
same
sure.
stuff?
I mean, for sure. But, look, I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the incredible legacy of Joe Biden, right, in his decades-long service for our country, both as a U.S. senator and of course, vice president and now president. Quite a remarkable legacy. In these last 4 years, 3.5 years, probably the most consequential period of any U.S. president in terms of the legislation that's passed that's going to help improve people's lives and strengthen communities throughout this nation. There's such a great record of success there. I was with the president in Atlanta and his team during that debate, and there was so much excitement and energy going into that debate. And of course, right after, it was like the air was let out of the balloon. Everyone was very deflated, of course. And as the days went on, depressed about our prospects, for sure. But I think the president, one of his greatest legacies will be the fact, as he said in his address to the nation, he at some point you have to put country ahead of ambition. And that should be the case in all times, right? But the president led the right way. His greatest legacy is that he put his country ahead of himself. It's this selfless act of leadership, of stepping away from power, is remarkable, right? And to pass the torch to not only the future of the Democratic Party, Vice President Harris, but also, frankly, as our country's changed now over so many years, this multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational democracy we live in, he's passed the torch to a woman who I think represents not only the future of our party, but also the future of this country. And so it's quite an exciting time. And as we've seen since Vice President Harris's announcement, not only did she quickly unify the party around the country behind her candidacy, but she's electrified and energized voters and the general public throughout this nation. So think about this: in 6 days' time, she's raised $200 million. 66% of that are first-time donors who have never given to the campaign. In the same time frame, their campaign recruited 170,000 volunteers who've signed up, right? People coming out of the woodwork. They're feeling excited and a sense of optimism and hope that we can still win this election. And that enthusiasm hasn't abated since then. I'm in rural Nevada right now on a 17-county tour, and as I've been traveling around this state, there's just record crowds and people who've never been to political events who are showing up now because of the opportunity in front of us. So it's really an exciting time. But I do want to caution folks, Mike, that we have 96 days left until the election, of course. And in Minnesota, we're the earliest early vote in the nation. We start voting and casting ballots for president on September 20th. And so we're right around the corner, less than 60 days away from when Minnesotans start to cast ballots. So, we can't take anything for granted. It's still going to be a close race, both in Minnesota and around the nation. But the stakes of this election are so existential and the energy is so high right now. I have great optimism for our chances in November.
I saw that one of the candidates for governor in North Dakota, Kelly Armstrong, who is a Republican, of course, mentioned to one of our people that he believes this is a sugar high for Democrats, that this is just the afterglow of changing horses in midstream, and he believes that it's going to abate at some time. I'm not so sure about that. I think there's something else there. What are your thoughts on that it's a sugar high, Ken?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, clearly, there's a lot of enthusiasm we're seeing right now. And I don't think it hasn't abated at this point. To my earlier comment, it continues. People are really coming out of the woodwork again, from giving, from volunteering to showing up at rallies and other events, the door knocking. We're seeing record amount of voter contact. So look, I just want to caution folks, this race will tighten up. It's going to be close, and no one should take anything for granted. Stay off the roller coaster, right? There's going to be polls that show us. There's going to be polls that show us up. There's going to be polls that show us down. We're going to hit a period where maybe the energy does wane a little bit, right? But the reality is that I don't see that happening. We've got a sprint now. Usually I tell folks it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're now in the sprint to the finish line, and we've got all the energy on our side. Look, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to finish the Olympics, and then we're going to bounce right into our convention. And we get the last word in the end of August in Chicago, where we get to put our candidate, our nominee, and her pick for vice president, and of course our party values on full display for Americans to see what we stand for, and the hope and the type of future that we're trying to build versus the dystopian future that the Republicans are trying to lead us into. Mike, make no mistake about it. The stakes, as I said before, are the same as they were before Biden dropped out as they are now, right? This is an election about the moving forward versus backward. It's about hope versus hate. It's about unity versus division, right? And as Vice President Harris said, it's about freedom versus chaos, right? No one wants to go back to those 4 years of Donald Trump, where all of us were so nervous about getting up in the morning about what our president had done to embarrass our nation at that time, or, what a nasty name he called someone, or what community he was going after next, right? And those were the very chaotic times, but in some ways, Americans have short memories, and we have to, and I hate to use this word, Mike, but we need to re-traumatize people. We need to remind them of how difficult those 4 years were for this country, and that we don't want to go back. While we do that, we also have to pivot to the future and give people a sense with Vice President Harris and her running mate about how we're going to continue to build on the success of these last 3.5 years and build a country that reflects our values.
The polar coaster. You must have some insight into my life because I'm a polar coaster guy. I spend way too much time on X, looking at all the political polls and clicking around the internet to read the latest. And I'll say this, and I'm no expert when it comes to polling, and I'm not sure that there are experts when it comes to polling, just the way things have worked out the last several years. But the polls do look better for Democrats today than they did a couple of weeks ago. Whether it's Minnesota, whether it's the nation as a whole, whether it's in several key swing states, it's still mostly within the margin of error. And Donald Trump can still win this election multiple ways. But things are at least looking a little bit better as of Wednesday, July 31st, correct?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, again, some of the horse race questions don't really matter to me right now in terms of the head-to-head matchups. What we look for in polling is trend lines that develop right over many different polls over many different months. Longitudinally, what I'm looking for is trends that are developing and ways that we have to tighten up our operations to reflect, those changes. Let me give you a good example of this. One of the challenges in recent months for the president in Minnesota, as an example, was just consolidating the base, getting Democrats to support his candidacy. And, in 2020, the keys to his success were 98% of Democrats around the country voted for him, right? They didn't want to spoil their vote. Unlike in 2016, where you had only about 89% of Democrats supporting Hillary around the country, you had a high defection rate of base voters. And so the key in this election has been consolidating the base. And up until recently, we still saw a little bit of a challenge there, some softness in the Democratic base supporting Joe Biden. But in recent polling since Vice President Harris's announcement, we've seen the consolidation starting to shift and starting to move in our direction. And that's the same with what we call third-party defection. Voters that we're moving towards a third-party candidate are now moving back towards Harris. And so those are good trend lines that are developing. I would just encourage people to stay off of the polar coaster in the sense of believing the horse race questions, because they're only a snapshot in time, right? The best poll and the only one that matters is the one on election day. And we should, as my old boss in politics, Paul Wellstone, used to say, is you run like you're 20 points behind, even if you're 20 points ahead. Yeah. If we do that in Minnesota, I think we'll win. I mean, Mike, look, one reason I have had the success in Minnesota as party chair, we haven't lost a statewide election. We're the dominant party in Minnesota. There's a lot of reasons for that, including, most importantly, our candidates and the messages and the campaigns they run. But we never take anything for granted at the DFL. We run like we're behind, even if we're ahead. We build a second to none operation in terms of a ground game and voter contact operation around the country. The Minnesota DFL is looked at as one of the best state parties in the nation. And it's not just because of our record of success, but it's because of how we build infrastructure and build our campaign operation to actually win. And so all things considered, look, Donald Trump talks a big game about wanting to flip Minnesota, but outside of a rally, he just hired his first person on board. They have no offices open around the state. And as far as I know, they haven't had one single conversation with the Minnesota voter about the upcoming election. And so I'm fairly confident, push comes to shove in the election where tomorrow, that we would keep Minnesota in the blue column.
So I know you told me not to do this, but I have to, because it's who I am. So when Ken Martin sees a Fox News poll showing Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, up 6 points in Minnesota, and a KSTP survey showing the Vice President up 10 points in Minnesota, you don't get excited about that? You just say, I'm not going to worry about that?
No, I mean, it's what I was saying earlier. The things we're looking at is underneath of those head-to-head polls, right? The trend lines developing with certain demographic groups, is it heading in the right direction? compare that to other polls. Are we actually moving the needle with certain demographic groups and certain geographic parts of the state that we need to win in? And all of that is really more important to me than what the head-to-head matchup looks like, because that's just a snapshot in time, and that will change. And also, the reason I really don't want people paying attention to this is because if you're up, people generally become complacent and think we're headed towards a sure win. And if you're down, they become deflated and think we're headed for a sure loss. And neither one of those are true. We've got 96 days until the election. There's a lot that could happen in 96 days. I mean, just think about what's happened in the last 10 days in American politics, right?
Yeah.
And so no one should ever take anything for granted in these polls. I would also say that historically, particularly the last 3 election cycles, and the way technology has changed, it's much harder for pollsters to get in touch with people. Polling has been historically inaccurate for at least the last 3 to 4 cycles. So again, you can't put too much stock in it. Just get out there and do the work, and that's the best thing that you can do to help. I do worry about polls a lot because I think they're skewed. So,
can Donald Trump win? Can Donald Trump win Minnesota? Is that a possibility?
Well, he could, but look, I mean, Donald Trump has been obsessed with Minnesota since 2016. He's a trophy collector, right? He collects trophy wives, trophy properties, and there's no bigger trophy for a Republican running for president than Minnesota. We have the longest streak of any voting for the Democratic presidential nominee. And as a result, Donald Trump is very much obsessed with flipping the state. But the difference this cycle is, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in 16 and 20, Donald Trump actually made an attempt to flip Minnesota. He had a deep investment in the state. He had offices around the state. He had organizers on the ground. They were communicating with voters. And here we are, less than 60 days away from where Minnesotans start to vote in this critical contest, and he has no infrastructure in the state. And as I said a moment ago, I'm not even sure that their campaign has talked to one single Minnesota voter. You contrast that with the fact that we've had over 25 offices open around the state for months now since the spring. We've had hundreds of organizers on the ground recruiting and organizing thousands of volunteers to have conversations with Minnesotans in every corner of the state about President Biden and Vice President Harris. These are the things in close races that matter, right? Organization, ground game, your ability to have conversations with voters in a high turnout state like Minnesota. All of that matters. And at this point, we just don't see that same type of operation that Trump's had in the past. So all that said, can he win? Sure. Like you said, there's 96 days left. But objectively looking at this, right, the reality is they're not really putting themselves in a position to win with at this point with just a few days or a few months left until the election's over.
Ken Martin, the chairman of the Minnesota DFL party, is our guest on the podcast today here at the McFeely Mess. Let's get into the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room for us Minnesotans, Ken, as I'm recording this from lovely Moorhead, Minnesota, one of the fastest growing communities around. The governor, Tim Walz, is in the mix to be Vice President Harris's running mate at the top of the ticket. First of all, what do you know? Do you know? Can you break news on the podcast today? Is Tim Walz going to be the running mate? And number two, what are your thoughts just from 30,000 feet on that? I found it fascinating. I found this whole process fascinating, just in the sense of I've seen a side of Governor Walz that I don't think many Minnesotans have seen. Maybe you've seen the side of him before, but he has been aggressive is the wrong word, but I want to say he's been frank. He's been honest. Not that he hasn't been honest before, but he has been out there really acting as a super clear communicator, a super likable, he's been, like the lovable uncle, the favorite uncle that everybody has. And he's kind of coined the term, that's weird. And that's sort of caught on nationally now. I mean, what do you see? What do you think?
Well, first off, let me start with your first question about what I know. Obviously as a vice chair of the DNC, I talk to the campaign all the time. I help chair the campaign in Minnesota but really, truly, it's all just wild speculation right now. We do know that the that the governor is being considered, and he should be considered, right? For a number of reasons. It's just fun to watch, though, Americans now starting to see what we've known for a long time, that we have a really great governor who, think about this. He's a teacher. He's a veteran. He's a football coach. He's a gun owner and a hunter. He obviously takes his work very seriously, but doesn't take himself too seriously. But most importantly, in terms of being an effective communicator, he's he can talk about really controversial issues in a very common sense way, right? He can, really relate with people around issues and values using that sort of Midwestern sensibilities that he has. And I think there's no one better equipped to appeal to Midwestern voters, but also Americans, frankly, than Tim Walz. I think, he has a record of success, both as congressman and then also these last, his 2 terms as governor have been remarkable in terms of the amount of really great legislation that was passed to make a difference in people's lives, right? And so, but I think when you think about this, right, and you contrast a Tim Walz with a J.D. Vance, the other piece of this is that there's no one, including J.D. Vance, that's going to be able to out small town Tim Walz, right, who grew up in rural Nebraska and graduated in a class of 25 people, half of them his cousins, as he says, right, moved to Mankato, Minnesota, a small town in southern Minnesota, to teach and meet his wife and start his family, right? Runs for Congress in a district that had only elected one Democrat before him in over 100 years, and wins in a very Republican district and holds the seat for 12 years, right? And in greater Minnesota, as you know, Mike, the governor always outperforms other Democrats on the ballot in counties throughout our state. And so in this election, if I was Vice President Harris, Tim Walz has to be considered because he's led on important issues. Minnesota is highly regarded as a state that's working, and the governor has a tremendous amount and deserves a tremendous amount of credit for what's happened here in recent years. And I think to your point, he also can take the fight to the Republicans in ways that it's going to be hard for them to push back on someone like Tim Walz, right? So anyways, I'm glad he's being considered. Who knows what will happen? But if nothing else, at the end of this, if Tim is not picked to be vice president, there's certainly a lot more Americans who know about him than they did just 10 days ago.
I like what you said there, and I'm glad you went there, Ken. But I guess one of the things I've liked about what Governor Walz has done in the last 10 days or so is that he's on the offensive. And as a Democrat myself, it just has felt for so long that we've been on the defensive, and the Republicans have sort of set the narrative at times, and we've sort of had to react to that narrative and always kind of be in a defensive position. The coin is flipped, and now it's the Republicans, it feels to me, that are on the defensive, and Governor Walz is out there. Hey, I mean, when Jake Tapper on CNN, says, well, people are going to look at your record, Governor, and say, you passed universal school lunches, you passed, rights protecting the freedom of choice in Minnesota. You've passed this. And Governor Walz said, whoa, wait a second here. What a monster I am. We're feeding school kids so they can learn. And if that's the label you can put on me, then put it on me. I'll happily wear that label. And when he said that, when I was watching that interview, I sort of went, damn right. I mean, why don't we as Democrats more often stand up for what we believe in and what we can pass and what we can do to help people and build a better America or a better state or a better county or a better city than always being on the defensive, fighting about things that don't matter. I mean, Governor Walz put it perfectly. Right. I love that.
Yeah. I think you're right on that. And I think the reality is we have a tendency as Democrats, we're we're like the Eeyore party, right? We like to hang our head and the woe is me, the half glass full, the sky is falling party, right? And
Yep.
we've got to stiffen our spine and raise our heads, be proud to be Democrats, and particularly in Minnesota, be proud to be DFLers. We have an amazing record of success to talk about, right? And that's true of President Biden and Vice President Harris. Vice President Harris has an amazing record to talk about, and we have an amazing record to talk about here in this state. But it's not just talking about that record, right? It's also contrasting what we've done to actually build our state in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind, right? When Governor Walz talks about one Minnesota, it's not just a slogan. It's in practice as well, which is how do we make sure that people, regardless of where they live in Minnesota, feel like they can get ahead and feel like we care about their lives and they're not being forgotten or left behind, right? How do we build a state that actually makes sure that families and children don't have to struggle as much, right? How do we build a state for the future that recognizes we have a responsibility as much to this generation as we do to future generations? The governor has led on that. And the string of policy success we've had here in this state is a model for around the nation. I mean, state legislators and governors around the country look to Minnesota as the example of how to actually make things work and govern in a way that's going to build inclusive communities and help improve people's lives. That's what Governor Walz has done. That's what he would bring to the ticket, is a record of success on how to actually, and again, it's always contrasting with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, because they've offered up no policy solutions to make a difference in people's lives. When Donald Trump was in office, he talked every week about passing an infrastructure bill, and he never got it done. He talked every week about actually solving the crisis at the border, and never got done, right? The reality is all the Republican Party is, especially evidenced by Project 2025, is actually going after people, dividing communities, pushing people out of the conversation, othering people who are different than them, right? Whether it's the trans community, the LGBTQ community, minority communities, and other marginalized peoples in this country. They're painting a very dystopian view of what would happen under an authoritarian regime with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And we have to call out that BS. We can't just let it stand. We've got to stand up and call it out and let people know, like Tim Walz does, that what they're trying to do, dividing this country, is not what we're trying to do.
Last question, because I know you have to run and I have a small window with you, Ken, but let's bring all of what we just talked about down to the state level, and what the DFL can do to compare and contrast themselves with Republicans in the state, because also the House of Representatives is up for grabs this fall. And again, you're not looking at certain polls, but I look at some and I went, oh, well, okay, things are looking okay. But I'll go back to the same thing you said about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and bring it down to the state level in Minnesota. And that's that the Republicans in Minnesota bitch and whine about everything Governor Walz does and about everything the DFL does, but they never offer their own policy solutions. Republicans in Minnesota fought tooth and nail to not feed school children. That was their stance. That was their platform. We are not going to feed school children. Then this summer, they took up the mantle of the state flag, that was going to be their biggest thing to get people to come out to the polls, was a state flag. Whatever you think of the flag, that's what they're focused on. And so take down everything we just talked about down to the state level, and what you think about what's happening at the local level in Minnesota, because that is also important, because Democrats right now in Minnesota have the trifecta: the House, the Senate, and the governor's office.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, of course, for our governor, the DFL, we desperately want to keep Minnesota blue in the presidential, and I think we will. But, Senator Klobuchar is on the ballot this year, and that will help us win down-ballot races here in Minnesota in particular. We need to keep the state House majority. I feel very bullish about our chances to do that. But we also have a special election in Senate District 45 that will determine the majority in the state Senate as well. And so both the Senate majority and the House majority are on the ballot this year. And we've got to make sure, particularly after the last 2 years of success we've had, if folks in Minnesota believe that we did things to help make a difference in their lives and their communities, then they need to continue to elect Democrats and DFLers to these important positions. So there's a lot at stake, of course. You mentioned the congressional races. We've got great congressional candidates running all over the states, of course. But one of the top races in the country will be in Congressional District 2, where we need to reelect Angie Craig. We've got a great opportunity in CD3 of keeping that seat in Democratic hands with Kelly Morrison. And, of course, we've got a great candidate in CD8, Jen Schultz, a wonderful candidate in CD1 in Rachel Bowman. And we got a good candidate out in CD7, John Peters, who's going to try to make the case that we need to get rid of Fishbach, who I'm not even convinced is going to win her primary in a couple of weeks. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yep, right. So, okay, Ken, I'll let you go. I appreciate your time. Keep on grinding, and we'll talk again as soon as we can, okay?
All right. Thanks so much, Mike. Take care.
Yep, you bet. Ken Martin, chairman of the DFL party in Minnesota. This has been the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the McFeely Mess podcast at Inforum.com. For more podcasts and columns, head to Inforum.com and search Mike McFeely